smell of smoke and broken glass filled the February air like a funeral shroud. It was 2:46 a.m., February 14th, 1965, Valentine's Day morning, but there was nothing romantic about the scene unfolding at 2311 97th Street in East Elmhurst, Queens. Malcolm X stood barefoot in the snow, his wife Betty clutching their 4 daughters against her chest. The youngest, Gamila, was barely 2 months old. Attila, 6 years old, was crying. Kubila and Ilyasa stood silent, their eyes wide with terror that no child should ever know. Behind them, their modest 2-story home was engulfed in flames. The Molotov cocktails had come through the front windows at exactly 2:45 a.m. Professional work, coordinated, designed not just to kill, but to send a message to anyone who dared follow Malcolm's path of independence from the Nation of Islam. Malcolm's hands shook as he watched 15 years of his life, his books, his writings, his children's toys disappear into the orange inferno. But his hands weren't shaking from the cold. They were shaking from rage, from the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness his enemies were watching, waiting to see if the flames would finish what they'd started. "Daddy, why did they burn our house?" Attila whispered, her small voice cutting through the roar of the fire. Malcolm knelt down, pulled his daughter close, and lied for the first time in years. "I don't know, baby. I don't know." But he did know. He knew exactly why. 3 months earlier, he'd walked away from Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. He'd declared his independence. He'd started his own organization. And in the world of religious politics, independence was the one sin that could never be forgiven. The fire department arrived 23 minutes later. The police showed up 41 minutes after that. They took pictures. They asked questions they already knew the answers to. They wrote reports that would disappear into filing cabinets and never see the light of day. By dawn, the fire was out. The house was a skeleton of charred wood and broken dreams. The family had nowhere to go. Malcolm's hands trembled as he dropped the dime into the payphone outside Jacobi Hospital. The metal was cold against his ear. Behind him, Betty sat in the emergency room with their daughters, all of them wrapped in Red Cross blankets, still smelling of smoke. He dialed the number for the 109th precinct. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Police, what's your emergency?" "This is Malcolm X. My home was firebombed early this morning. My family and I need protection. Malcolm who?" The voice was different now, colder, like someone had suddenly recognized the name and decided they didn't want to hear what came next. "Malcolm X, Minister Malcolm X. Someone tried to kill my family tonight. They threw firebombs into our house while my children were sleeping. I need—" "Mr. X," the interruption was sharp, final. "We're aware of the incident. Detectives are investigating. As for protection, we can't spare the men." "Cannot spare the men?" Malcolm's voice rose despite himself. "Someone just tried to murder 4 little girls in their beds, and you can't spare the men?" "Sir, we have limited resources. The investigation is ongoing. If you have specific information about suspects—" "The suspects are the same people who've been threatening me for months, the same people I've been reporting to your department, the same people whose threats you've been filing away and forgetting." "Mr. X, I understand you're upset, but—" "Upset?" Malcolm's laugh was bitter. "Officer, if someone throws a bomb at your children tonight, will you be upset? Or will you expect the police department you serve to protect your family?" There was a long pause. In the background, Malcolm could hear radio chatter, phones ringing, the ordinary business of law enforcement. The ordinary business that apparently didn't include protecting black ministers who'd made too many enemies. "Mr. X," the voice said finally, "maybe you should consider that your lifestyle choices have consequences. Maybe if you hadn't made so many enemies, you wouldn't need so much protection." The line went dead. Malcolm stood there for a long moment, listening to the dial tone. Around him, Queens went about its business. Cars passed, people walked to work. Life continued as if nothing had happened, as if a family hadn't just been terrorized in their sleep. He hung up the phone and realized something that chilled him more than the February wind. He was completely alone. The government wanted him surveilled. The Nation of Islam wanted him dead. The police wanted him to disappear. And somewhere out there, men with bombs and guns were planning their next move. For the first time in his adult life, Malcolm X was afraid. The Lenox Lounge on 125th Street was a different world. Even at noon, the club was dim, filled with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of dangerous conversations. This was Bumpy Johnson's office, his throne room, his fortress in the heart of Harlem. Malcolm had never been inside before. As a minister, he'd always kept his distance from the street element. But as he pushed through the heavy doors, he realized that the street element might be his only salvation. The conversation stopped when he entered. Every head turned. These weren't churchgoers. These were numbers runners, policy collectors, enforcers, men who solved problems with methods that would never be discussed in any mosque. They recognized Malcolm, but they also knew he didn't belong here. Bumpy Johnson sat at a corner table, a newspaper spread in front of him, a cup of coffee cooling at his elbow. At 61, he was still imposing, not physically large, but carrying himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd never lost a war he'd chosen to fight. He looked up as Malcolm approached. "Minister," he said quietly, "I heard about your house. You and your family all right?" Malcolm nodded, suddenly uncertain how to begin. "We're alive." "Sit down." It wasn't a request. Malcolm sat. The two men studied each other across the small table. They were roughly the same age, both products of the same streets, but they'd chosen radically different paths to power. Malcolm had chosen the pulpit. Bumpy had chosen the shadows. "You didn't come here for coffee," Bumpy said. "No. I came because—" Malcolm paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because last night, someone tried to kill my children. And this morning, the police told me they couldn't spare the men to protect my family." Bumpy's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Police said that?" "They said maybe if I hadn't made so many enemies, I wouldn't need so much protection." Bumpy set down his coffee cup. The sound of porcelain against wood seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet club. "Malcolm, let me ask you something. You believe in God, right?" "Of course." "And you believe God protects the righteous?" "I do." "Well," Bumpy leaned back in his chair, "sometimes God uses imperfect instruments to do his work. You fight for their souls, Red. Let me fight for their bodies." Malcolm studied the man across from him. Bumpy Johnson was everything Malcolm preached against, a criminal, a man who profited from the weaknesses of others, someone who'd built his power on violence and intimidation. But he was also the only person in New York City who had the power to say no to Malcolm's enemies and make it stick. "What are you offering?" "Protection. Real protection. The kind the police can't provide and your enemies can't penetrate." Bumpy's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "My men will watch your family, 24 hours a day, every speaking engagement, every public appearance, every trip to the grocery store. Nobody gets close without my permission. And in return, nothing. Respect is free between men who've earned it." Malcolm felt something break inside his chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. For the first time since the bombs had crashed through his windows, he could breathe. "There is one condition," Bumpy continued. "My men don't take orders from you, they take orders from me. If they say it's too dangerous, you listen. If they say cancel the event, you cancel it. Your life isn't just yours anymore. It belongs to your children, your wife, your movement. Don't waste it on pride." Malcolm extended his hand across the table. "Thank you." Bumpy shook it. "Thank me when you're still alive to write your memoirs." The transformation was immediate and surreal. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the Audubon Ballroom for a scheduled speech to find the venue surrounded, not by police, but by men in dark overcoats who moved with the fluid precision of professional soldiers. They checked every entrance, every window, every potential sniper position within 3 blocks. These weren't street thugs. These were Bumpy's elite. Men who'd survived the numbers wars, the territorial disputes, the decades of conflict with Italian crime families. Men who understood violence not as chaos, but as a precise tool requiring skill and planning. Malcolm watched from his car as an NYPD patrol unit pulled up to the ballroom. 2 officers got out, saw Bumpy's men, and immediately radioed for backup. Within minutes, 6 police cars had arrived. The standoff lasted 47 minutes. Bumpy himself finally emerged from a black Cadillac and walked slowly towards the cluster of police vehicles. He was alone, hands visible, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that every gesture was being interpreted by nervous cops with itchy trigger fingers. The police captain stepped forward. Malcolm couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read body language. The captain was angry, gesturing emphatically. Bumpy stood motionless, his response calm and brief. After a few minutes, the captain threw up his hands, got back in his car, and led the entire convoy away. Bumpy's men remained. "Mr. Johnson," said Malcolm when Bumpy approached his car, "what did you tell them?" "I told them that as long as my men don't break any laws, they have no authority to move them. I told them that every man out here is legally armed and licensed to carry. I told them that this is still America, and Americans have the right to gather peacefully on public streets. And if they'd insisted?" Bumpy's smile was thin. "Then I'd have told them that Harlem has a very long memory, and police officers have to live somewhere after their shift ends." Malcolm felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. This was the power he'd always preached against, the power of fear, intimidation, the implied threat of violence. But it was also the only thing standing between his family and death. "Minister," Bumpy continued, "you go give your speech. Talk about justice, equality, the brotherhood of man. Build the world you want to see. My man will make sure you live long enough to see it built." For 6 weeks, it worked perfectly. Malcolm spoke at rallies, universities, community centers across the country. Everywhere he went, Bumpy's shadows followed. They were invisible to the audience, but clearly visible to anyone who might have violent intentions. The death threats continued, but they remained threats. No more firebombs, no more midnight visits. Malcolm's enemies had learned that attacking him meant answering to forces they couldn't intimidate or bribe or reason with. But success came with a price that Malcolm hadn't anticipated. The newspaper headline hit like a physical blow. "Malcolm X's Gangster Bodyguards. Civil rights leader protected by Harlem crime boss." The article was devastating. Photos of Bumpy's men at Malcolm's rallies, speculation about financial arrangements, questions about whether Malcolm's message of self-determination was being compromised by his association with organized crime. Worse were the reactions from within Malcolm's own organization. Board members asked pointed questions. Donors withdrew support. The very people Malcolm was trying to reach began to question whether he was just another politician making deals with criminals for personal protection. The breaking point came during a phone call from a major civil rights leader Malcolm had been trying to court for months. "Malcolm, I've got to be straight with you. Having Bumpy Johnson's men at your events is a problem, a big problem. It makes you look like you can't stand on your own principles. It makes the whole movement look corrupt. Those men have kept me alive. At what cost? You're supposed to be teaching Black Americans to stand up for themselves, not hide behind gangsters. How can you preach self-reliance while relying on someone else's army? That night, Malcolm sat in his temporary apartment. They'd rented a place in Manhattan while the house in Queens was being rebuilt, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Betty was asleep beside him, exhausted from weeks of stress and fear. Their daughters were finally sleeping peacefully, no longer waking up screaming from nightmares about fire and broken glass. But the weight of the decision was crushing him. He could keep Bumpy's protection and watch his credibility erode, or he could send away the only thing keeping his family alive and hope that moral authority would stop bullets. By morning, he'd made his choice. The meeting took place in the same corner booth at the Lenox Lounge where their arrangement had begun, but this time Malcolm was the one bringing bad news. "Bumpy, I need to ask you to pull your men back." Bumpy had been expecting this conversation. Malcolm could see it in his eyes, disappointment but no surprise. The newspapers? The newspapers, the board, the donors, the other civil rights leaders, everyone's asking how I can preach independence while hiding behind your protection. And what are you telling them? I'm telling them that sometimes a man has to choose between being right and being alive. And you're choosing to be right? I'm choosing to be authentic. I can't build a movement based on self-determination if I can't demonstrate it myself. I can't ask people to stand up if I won't stand up. Bumpy was quiet for a long time, studying Malcolm's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Malcolm had ever heard it. "Malcolm, you're one of the smartest men I know, but you're about to make the stupidest decision of your life." "Maybe, but it's my decision to make." "No, it's not." Bumpy's voice hardened. "It's not just your decision anymore. You've got a wife, you've got 4 daughters, you've got thousands of people who depend on your voice, your leadership, your ideas. You think you're being noble, but you're being selfish." "Selfish?" "Selfish. You want to feel pure. You want to feel authentic. You want to sleep at night knowing you haven't compromised your principles. But purity is a luxury, Malcolm. It's a luxury dead men can't afford." "So what am I supposed to do? Keep my mouth shut? Stop fighting? Accept that the price of speaking truth is living like a prisoner?" "You're supposed to stay alive," Bumpy said quietly. "You're supposed to understand that martyrdom is easy, living is hard. Changing the world takes time, and time is dead men don't have." They sat in silence for several minutes. Around them, the club continued its business. Quiet conversations, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards from the poker game in the back room. The ordinary sounds of life continuing while 2 men discussed death. "If I withdraw my protection, you'll be dead within a week." "You don't know that. I know the people who want you dead. I know how they think, how they plan, how they execute. Right now, they're afraid to move because they know touching you means war with me. The minute my men disappear, they'll strike." Malcolm nodded slowly. "I understand the risk." "Do you? Do you really understand what it means for Betty to identify your body, for your daughters to grow up without a father, for your movement to lose its voice just when it's finding its power?" "Yes," Malcolm said, though his voice cracked slightly. "I understand all of that." Bumpy stared at him for another long moment, then reached across the table and placed his hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "You're a good man, Malcolm. You're a righteous man. But righteousness doesn't stop bullets, and I can't protect someone who won't let himself be protected." He stood up, straightened his jacket, and looked down at Malcolm one last time. "When it happens, and it will happen, remember that you chose this. Remember that you had another option." Bumpy walked away without looking back. Malcolm sat alone at the table for another hour, watching the ice melt in his untouched drink, knowing he'd just signed his own death warrant in the name of authenticity. February 21st, 1965, 2 p.m., the Audubon Ballroom. Malcolm stood backstage, adjusting his tie, listening to the crowd settling into their seats. 400 people had come to hear him speak about the organization of Afro-American unity, his vision for international black solidarity. For the first time in 6 weeks, he was alone. No shadows in the balcony, no men checking IDs at the door, no professional security scanning the crowd for weapons or suspicious faces. He felt naked. Betty was in the audience with their children, sitting in the front row as always. She'd argued against bringing the girls, but Malcolm had insisted. They need to see their father standing up, he'd said. They need to understand what we're fighting for. At 3:05 p.m., Malcolm walked onto the stage. The crowd rose, applauding enthusiastically. He felt their energy, their hope, their trust in his leadership. This was what he'd been born to do, to speak truth to power, to challenge systems of oppression, to inspire people to demand better for themselves and their children. "Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters," he began. "Wa alaikum salam," the crowd responded. The interruption came 3 minutes later, a disturbance in the back of the room, voices raised in argument. Malcolm paused, raising his hands to calm the situation. Hold it, brothers. Let's be cool. Let's take it easy." That's when Norman 3X Butler stood up in the front row, his hand emerging from his jacket with a sawed-off shotgun. The first blast knocked Malcolm backward. Before he hit the floor, 2 more men rushed the stage with pistols. 21 bullets in total, 15 seconds of sustained gunfire. By 3:30 p.m., Malcolm X was dead. The phone rang in Bumpy Johnson's office at 3:47 p.m. "Mr. Johnson?" The voice was young, shaky, one of his street-level operatives. "Malcolm's been shot at the Audubon. He's gone, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy set the phone down gently, but his hands were trembling. He'd been expecting this call for 8 days, since the morning Malcolm had asked him to pull back his protection. But expecting tragedy doesn't lessen its impact. He walked to the window overlooking 125th Street. Down below, Harlem went about its Sunday afternoon business. People walking to church, to family dinners, to the ordinary pleasures of a community that had no idea it had just lost its greatest voice. Someone knocked on his door. "Come in." It was Illinois Gordon, his most trusted lieutenant. "Boss, we just heard. What do you want us to do?" Bumpy was quiet for a long time, watching the street, thinking about choices and consequences, about friendship and responsibility, about the terrible mathematics of violence. "Nothing," he said finally. "Nothing? Boss, they killed Malcolm. They killed him because we weren't there to stop it." "No." Bumpy turned around, his face etched with grief and rage. "They killed him because he chose to die authentic rather than live protected. They killed him because he believed in something more important than his own survival." He sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 61 years. "Malcolm thought I was the one with blood on his hands, but he was wrong. The blood was always going to be his. The only question was whether it would spill in a basement somewhere, quietly, forgotten, or on a stage in front of witnesses where the whole world would have to see it." Gordon shifted uncomfortably. "So we just let this go? We don't make them pay?" "Malcolm wouldn't want revenge. He'd want justice. He'd want his death to mean something." Bumpy picked up the newspaper from his desk, staring at Malcolm's photograph on the front page. "And maybe that's the difference between me and him. I would have kept him alive and let someone else be the martyr.
He chose to be the martyr himself. Was he right? Bumpy was quiet for another long moment. Outside, church bells were ringing across Harlem, calling the faithful to evening services. Services where Malcolm's name would be spoken, his memory honored, his message carried forward by people who had heard him speak and been changed by his words. "Ask me in 50 years," Bumpy said finally. "Ask me if the world Malcolm dreamed about ever came to pass. Ask me if his death inspired more change than his life could have achieved. Ask me if martyrdom was worth more than the 30 more years he might have had to build his movement, raise his daughters, speak his truth." He folded the newspaper and placed it in his desk drawer. "And I'll tell you what I know right now. I know that yesterday I had a friend. Today I have a conscience. And tomorrow I'll wake up knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone you care about is let them make their own mistakes." The church bells continued to ring as the sun set over Harlem, marking the end of a day when everything changed, when a voice was silenced, when a movement lost its most charismatic leader to the very authenticity that had made him great. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, the men who had planned Malcolm's assassination were learning that killing a man and killing his message were two very different things. The revolution would continue, but it would continue without Malcolm X, and that loss would echo through the decades, a reminder that courage and wisdom don't always point in the same direction. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay alive.